The morning sun cast long shadows across Mr. Lee's spacious penthouse office as he stood by the floor-to-ceiling windows, his reflection ghosting against the cityscape below. At 45, he had everything money could buy: successful tech companies, luxury cars, and now his newest acquisition, the Golden Pearl, a once legendary restaurant in the heart of downtown. But something wasn't sitting right in his gut. The restaurant's recent customer reviews had been declining, and the employee satisfaction surveys painted a concerning picture. Mr. Lee ran his fingers through his salt and pepper hair, remembering the days when he was just a teenage dishwasher, dreaming of making it big while scrubbing pots until his hands turned red and raw. "There's something missing," he muttered to himself, picking up the latest report from his mahogany desk. The numbers were there, black and white, telling him about high turnover rates and dropping morale, but they felt lifeless. Cold. They didn't tell him about the people behind those statistics. That's when the idea hit him, crazy enough to work, risky enough to be worth it. He pressed the intercom button. "Mrs. Shang, could you come in for a moment?" His trusted assistant of 15 years walked in, her usual composed self with a tablet in hand. "Yes, sir." "I need your help with something unusual." He gestured for her to sit down. "What would you say if I told you I wanted to become homeless for 2 weeks?" Mrs. Zhang's normally unshakable demeanor cracked slightly. I'm sorry, could you repeat that?" Mr. Lee's eyes lit up with the same spark she'd seen when he was about to launch a new venture. "Not actually homeless. Disguised as homeless. I want to observe the Golden Pearl from the outside, see how things really run when nobody knows the boss is watching. Sir, with all due respect." Mrs. Shang began, but Mr. Lee was already pacing, his excitement building. "Think about it. Reports and numbers can't tell me how our people really behave. Do they treat others with kindness when nobody's looking? Are they cutting corners when supervisors aren't around? What are they saying about their jobs, their struggles, their dreams?" His voice softened as he remembered his own past. "You know, when I was washing dishes at Happy Dragon restaurant, the owner never once spoke to us kitchen staff. He'd come in wearing his expensive suit, check the books and leave. He never knew that his head chef was teaching us English after hours, or that the waitresses were pooling their tips to help the busboy pay for his mother's medicine." Mrs. Shan watched her boss carefully. In their 15 years together, she'd seen his brilliant ideas and his occasional wild ones. This seemed like both. "And you think becoming homeless will give you these insights?" "Exactly." Mr. Lee stopped pacing and leaned against his desk. "A homeless person becomes invisible to most people. They let their guard down, show their true colors. Some ignore, some help, some, well, that's what I want to find out." Mrs. Sejong sighed, already pulling up her tablet. "You'll need a complete transformation. Clothes, appearance, mannerisms. And what about the board? The shareholders?" Mr. Lee waved his hand dismissively. "Tell them I'm on a business trip to Singapore. Only you and Chairman Wong need to know the truth. Can you help me make this happen?" Looking at her boss's determined expression, Mrs. Stone knew there was no talking him out of it. "I'll need a few days to arrange everything. We'll need to think about security, emergency protocols, and maintaining your cover." "Perfect." Mr. Lee's enthusiasm was contagious. "And Mrs. Zhang? Thank you for not telling me I'm crazy." She allowed herself a small smile. "Oh, I think you're completely crazy, sir, but sometimes crazy works." Over the next few days, Mrs. Zhang orchestrated the transformation with military precision. They visited multiple thrift stores in different districts, picking clothes that looked worn, but were still sturdy enough for extended wear. A makeup artist friend of hers, sworn to secrecy, taught Mr. Lee how to apply subtle dirt effects and make his clean-shaven face look naturally unkempt. They created a detailed backstory. He would be Mr. Kim, a former factory supervisor who lost everything during the economic downturn. They practiced his walking style, how to appear tired but not defeated, poor but not helpless. Mr. Lee spent hours watching documentaries about homeless individuals, learning their patterns, understanding their daily challenges. Remember, Mrs. Zhang instructed during their final preparation, you're not playing a character. You're stepping into someone else's life. Their reality. Their struggles. This isn't about fooling people, it's about understanding them. The night before his experiment was to begin, Mr. Lee stood in his penthouse one last time, looking at his reflection in the window. Tomorrow, he would step into another world, leaving behind every comfort he'd grown accustomed to. He felt nervous, excited, and somehow more alive than he had in years. "Time to remember what it feels like to be invisible," he whispered to his reflection. As the city lights twinkled below, he couldn't help but wonder what truths he would discover about his restaurant, his employees, and perhaps most importantly, about himself. Dawn broke over the city as Mr. Lee stood in front of his bathroom mirror for the last time as himself. His designer watch read 5:30 a.m., a time when most of the city still slept, perfect for beginning his transformation. He took one final hot shower, knowing it would be his last taste of luxury for 2 weeks. "Are you absolutely sure about this?" Mrs. Zhang asked, arranging the items they'd gathered on his living room coffee table. Her usual professional demeanor couldn't hide her concern. "More sure than ever," Mr. Lee replied, emerging from the bathroom in a worn undershirt and faded jeans that already felt foreign against his skin. He picked up the old boots they'd bought from a thrift store, turning them over in his hands. They were scuffed and weathered, telling stories of someone else's hard times. Mrs. Zhang approached with a small jar of stage makeup. "Let's start with your face. Remember what Ms. Lin taught us. We're not creating dirt, we're creating history." Her gentle hands worked the makeup into the creases around his eyes, along his jawline, and into the pores of his skin. Not enough to look fake, just enough to suggest someone who hadn't had access to proper washing facilities for a while. As she worked, Mr. Lee practiced his new voice, slightly rougher with a hint of wariness. "I was thinking about my backstory last night," he said. "Maybe instead of losing everything in the economic downturn, I lost it all trying to save my small business. It feels more personal." Mrs. Zhang nodded approvingly. "That works better. It's closer to truth, which makes it easier to remember and tell convincingly." She stepped back to examine her work, then reached for the hair products. They'd decided against dramatic changes like fake beards or wigs, too risky for extended wear. Instead, they used temporary hair color to add hints of gray and styling products to make his usually neat hair look unwashed and slightly unkempt. "The key," Mrs. Zhang reminded him, "is consistency in your story. You're Mr. Kim, former owner of a small electronics repair shop. You tried to keep your employees paid during the downturn, took out loans, and eventually lost everything. It's been 8 months on the streets." Mr. Lee repeated the details under his breath as she continued working. They'd spent hours developing this backstory, making sure it was detailed enough to be convincing but simple enough to remember naturally. The transformation continued methodically. They layered his clothes carefully. A thin t-shirt under a faded plaid button-up, topped with a one jacket that was slightly too big. Each piece had been carefully selected and then deliberately aged. Mrs. Zhang had even sewed a few strategic patches onto the jacket, making it look maintained despite poverty. "The shoes are crucial," she said, handing him the boots. "People who've been homeless for months develop a particular way of walking, like they're carrying the weight of their circumstances. We practiced this." Mr. Lee nodded, slipping his feet into the boots. They were actually his size but felt completely different from his Italian leather shoes. He took a few practice steps, letting his shoulders slump slightly, his usual confident stride becoming more measured. "The wedding ring," Mrs. Zhang reminded him, holding out a simple brass band they'd tarnished slightly. "Remember, you still wear it because you couldn't bear to sell it. It's your last connection to your former life." As he slipped it on, Mr. Lee felt a surprising wave of emotion. This small detail made everything feel more real. The story of loss and struggle they'd created was beginning to feel less like a disguise and more like an alternate reality. They'd prepared a small backpack with carefully chosen items. A few crumpled food wrappers, an old water bottle, a worn paperback book, and a small notebook with some scribbled entries dating back months. Each item helped build the story of Mr. Kim's life on the streets. "Your phone," Mrs. Zhang said, holding out an old flip phone, "is only for emergencies. I'm the only contact, save his sister. If anyone sees it, you said you keep it charged at the library, and it's your lifeline for job interviews." Mr. Lee tucked it deep into an inner pocket of his jacket. The weight of it felt like a small safety net, one he hoped he wouldn't need. Finally, Mrs. Zhang handed him a small hand mirror. take a look at your new self." The reflection shocked him. The man looking back wasn't just wearing different clothes, he looked like a different person entirely. The subtle makeup aging, the slightly hollow look in his eyes, the way his clothes hung on his frame, it all came together to create someone who looked like they'd been worn down by life but was still holding onto their dignity. "The next 2 weeks," Mrs. Stone said softly, "you'll see a side of life most people in your position never experience. Remember why you're doing this. It's not about tricks or catching people doing wrong. It's about understanding." Mr. Lee nodded, suddenly feeling the weight of what he was about to do. 2 weeks, he repeated. 2 weeks to learn the truth about my restaurant and the people who work there. They went over the final details, his observation spots near the Golden Pearl, safe places to spend the nights, emergency protocols if something went wrong. Mrs. Shang would check on him discreetly every day, and Chairman Wong would handle any urgent business matters. As the sun rose higher in the sky, Mr. Lee took one last look around his penthouse. Everything he was leaving behind, the comfort, the luxury, the power, suddenly seemed both precious and somehow less important than what he was about to learn. "Ready?" Mrs. Stom asked, holding the service elevator door open. They'd chosen this exit to avoid the lobby security cameras. Mr. Lee took a deep breath and stepped into his new reality. "Ready to disappear," he said, and as the elevator doors closed, he left behind not just his privileged life, but also his assumptions about the world he thought he knew so well. The first thing Mr. Lee noticed was how differently the morning air felt when you couldn't escape it. He'd walked these same streets countless times before, but never like this. The early morning chill crept through his worn jacket as he made his way toward the Golden Pearl, his new boots scuffing against the pavement. His first hour as Mr. Kim was a harsh education in invisibility. Business people hurried past, their eyes sliding over him like he was part of the urban landscape. A fire hydrant, a newspaper stand, something to walk around without really seeing. A woman pulled her purse closer as she passed. A man in a suit crossed to the other side of the street. Finding his observation spot took time. He finally settled on a corner about 50 feet from the restaurant's back entrance, positioning himself where he could see both the employee entrance and the main doors. The concrete was cold and rough beneath him as he sat down, his back against the wall of an adjacent building. The morning shift began arriving around 6 a.m. The kitchen staff came first, hurrying in through the back door with their heads down, carrying bags of their own knives and equipment. Mr. Lee recognized some faces from personnel files, but they looked different now, more tired, more real. A delivery truck arrived, and he watched the driver argue with the morning supervisor about missing items. From his spot, he could hear every word. "Look, I've got 3 more stops to make. Sign for what's here, and take it up with the company later." The supervisor's shoulders slumped as he signed the paperwork, muttering about budget cuts and quality control. Around 8 a.m., the smell of breakfast prep began wafting through the air. Mr. Lee's stomach growled. He'd deliberately skipped breakfast to better understand his role. The aroma of bacon and fresh bread was almost torturous. He watched as customers began trickling in, some regulars greeting the staff by name through the windows. The morning shift supervisor, Mr. Chen, caught his attention. Every morning, like clockwork, Mr. Chen would step out for a quick smoke break. But instead of just smoking, he'd scan the area, his eyes taking in everything, including Mr. Lee. On the 3rd day, Mr. Chen approached. "Here," he said, holding out half a breakfast sandwich wrapped in paper. "Kitchen made extra by mistake." They both knew it wasn't true, but the lie preserved dignity on both sides. "Thank you," Mr. Lee replied in his practiced voice, accepting the food. The sandwich was still warm. Mr. Chen lit his cigarette, leaning against the wall. "Used to see my uncle on streets like this," he said quietly. "After his factory closed. Proud man, never asked for help. He took a long drag. Sometimes help shouldn't need asking." The interaction shifted something in Mr. Lee's perspective. He'd expected to learn about his employees' work habits, but instead, he was learning about their hearts. Not everyone showed the same kindness. The evening supervisor, Mr. Park, was a different story entirely. He'd emerge from the back door like a storm cloud, shouting at any homeless people in the vicinity. "Get out of here. You're bad for business." "I'll call the police." One evening, Mr. Lee watched Mr. Park throw away perfectly good leftover food rather than let the kitchen staff take it home or give it to those in need. Company policy, he barked at a young waitress who protested. Can't risk getting sued if someone gets sick. The cold was the hardest part. Even with his layers, the chills seeped into his bones during long hours of sitting still. Rain was worse. The awning over his spot only protected so much, and his jacket would grow heavy with moisture. But the physical discomfort paled compared to the emotional toll. Being ignored hundreds of times a day wore at his spirit in ways he hadn't expected. He watched people actively avoid looking at him, parents pulling their children closer as they passed, security guards from nearby businesses checking their watches meaningfully. Yet there were moments of surprising humanity. A street musician shared her coffee with him one morning. An elderly woman stopped to ask if he needed socks. She carried clean pairs to give out. A young businessman who got his morning coffee at the Golden Pearl started leaving his change in a cup near Mr. Lee, never making eye contact but never forgetting. Through it all, he watched his restaurant with new eyes. He saw the prep cook who always seemed to arrive early, practicing English with flashed cards before his shift. He noticed the waitress who limped slightly but never complained, even during the lunch rush. He observed the dishwasher, barely more than a teenager, carefully wrapping leftover rolls in napkins and sharing them with other homeless people during his breaks. One particularly cold morning, he overheard two servers talking during their smoke break. Did you see the new numbers they want? 15 tables per server, no exceptions. How are we supposed to give good service like that? Better than losing hours, the other replied. My kids' braces aren't going to pay for themselves. Mr. Lee found himself taking mental notes not just about business operations, but about lives. Every employee had a story, every interaction revealed something about the restaurant's true culture. The formal reports he'd read in his office seemed laughably inadequate now. On his 10th day, a health inspector visited. From his vantage point, Mr. Lee watched Mr. Park frantically directing staff to hide certain items, to quickly clean areas that should have been maintained regularly. The inspector, wearing a bored expression, seemed to barely glance at critical areas. That same evening, he witnessed one of the line cooks stay 2 hours after his shift, refusing to serve soup that hadn't cooled properly despite Mr. Park's insistence that it was fine. My grandmother taught me better, the cook said firmly. Food safety isn't about rules, it's about caring for people. Each day brought new insights, new perspectives. Mr. Lee began to understand that the Golden Pearl wasn't just a business with employees and customers, it was a complex ecosystem of human lives intersecting in countless ways. Every policy he'd ever implemented, every budget decision he'd made from his comfortable office, rippled through these lives in ways he'd never fully appreciated. As the sun set on another day of observation, Mr. Lee touched the brass ring on his finger, its weight now familiar. He'd started this experiment thinking he would learn about his business. Instead, he was learning about humanity, both its capacity for indifference and its persistent, surprising warmth. Mrs. Xiang's daily check-ins became moments of reflection. The real question, she said during one of their brief meetings, isn't just what you're seeing, but what you're going to do with what you've learned. Looking up at the illuminated sign of the Golden Pearl, Mr. Lee realized she was right. This wasn't just about gathering information anymore. It was about responsibility, not just to the business, but to the human beings who gave it life. As his second week of observation began, Mr. Lee started noticing the deeper patterns that only time could reveal. His spot near the Golden Pearl had become more than just a surveillance point. It had become a window into the souls of those who worked there. One rainy morning, he overheard the young prep cook, Mr. Wu, talking on his phone during break. Yes, Professor, I'll have the assignment in by tonight. No problem at all. After hanging up, Mr. Wu pulled out a worn laptop from his backpack, balancing it carefully on his knees under the shelter of the back door's awning. Mr. Lee watched as the young man typed furiously between prep tasks, clearly working on something important. Later that day, Mrs. Xiang made her usual discreet check-in, pretending to smoke while updating him. I did some digging, she whispered. Mr. Wu is working 2 jobs while pursuing his master's degree in business administration. He's maintaining a 3.8 GPA despite working 50 hours a week. Mr. Lee felt a mixture of admiration and shame. Here was someone showing the same drive he'd had in his youth, yet the restaurant's entry-level wages meant Mr. Wu needed a second job just to stay afloat. But the most surprising discoveries came from watching Mr. Park, the evening supervisor. While his harsh treatment of homeless people and strict enforcement of rules painted one picture, Mr. Lee began to notice something else. Every Tuesday, Mr. Park would arrive with a stack of papers, which he'd review anxiously during his breaks. Through careful observation and Mrs. Stone's research, Mr. Lee learned these were unemployment forms. Mr. Park was helping his laid-off former co-workers navigate the system, using his lunch breaks to make calls on their behalf. "It's complicated," Mrs. Stone commented during one update. "He's not just the villain we thought he was. He's trapped in a system that rewards certain behaviors and punishes others." The kitchen staff's situation proved even more eye-opening. The head cook, Mrs. Lai, ran her kitchen with military precision, but Mr. Lee noticed she always carried a large cooler bag. One evening, his curiosity piqued when he saw her secretly distributing containers to certain staff members. "Special food?" he asked the dishwasher boy during one of their now regular bread-sharing moments. The boy smiled. "Mrs. Lee cooks extra at home for those of us who she knows are struggling. She says nobody can work well on an empty stomach, and the staff meal allowance isn't enough anymore." This revelation hit Mr. Lee hard. He'd approved the cut in meal allowances 6 months ago, seeing it as a reasonable cost-saving measure. Now he understood its real impact and how his employees were quietly taking care of each other despite his policies. More surprises came from watching the regular customers. An elderly couple who came every Sunday would discreetly leave extra-large tips, specifically requesting they be shared with the kitchen staff. A local business owner would bring in day-old pastries from his bakery, officially as samples, but really to help supplement the staff's meals. One particularly memorable afternoon, Mr. Lee watched a scene unfold that changed everything. A young woman, clearly pregnant, came to apply for a server position. Mr. Park conducted the interview at a corner table, visible through the window. Despite her obvious qualification, Mr. Lee could see her previous experience from the resume. Mr. Park seemed hesitant. "Company policy," he kept saying, though Mr. Lee knew there was no such policy. "We need someone who can commit to at least a year without interruptions." The woman's face fell, but she maintained her composure. As she left, Mrs. Lai emerged from the kitchen, quickly caught up with her, and had a quiet conversation. The next day, the woman returned, this time through the back door, wearing kitchen whites. Mrs. Lai had hired her as a prep cook, a position with more flexible hours and less physical strain. When Mr. Park confronted her about it, Mrs. Lai stood her ground. "The kitchen budget is my responsibility," she said firmly, "and I say we need her. Unless you want to explain to the owner why our prep times have increased." Mr. Lee watched this power dynamic with fascination. His employees had created their own system of checks and balances, finding ways to help each other while still maintaining the restaurant's standards. The most profound revelation came through the small acts of kindness he witnessed daily. The bartender who would accidentally make extra smoothies during slow periods, sharing them with staff who looked tired. The hostess who kept a stash of bus tokens in her apron, quietly slipping them to co-workers who needed help getting home. The maintenance man who fixed staff members' cars on his days off, asking only for the cost of parts. One evening, as closing time approached, Mr. Lee observed something that brought tears to his eyes. A young family came to the door just as Mr. Park was turning the sign to closed. The parents looked defeated. Clearly, this was to be a special meal, perhaps their only restaurant visit in a long time. Mr. Park started to turn them away, but Mrs. Lai happened to be passing by. She took one look at the family, marched to the door, and opened it wide. "Kitchen's still hot," she announced. "We can serve one more family." The look of joy on the children's faces was matched only by the proud smiles of the staff who stayed late to serve them. Nobody complained about the extra work. Instead, they turned it into a celebration, with Mr. Wu entertaining the kids with napkin origami while their food was prepared. As Mr. Lee watched this scene, everything he'd learned over the past 2 weeks crystallized into a clear understanding. His restaurant wasn't just a business, it was a community. Every policy he'd implemented, every cost-cutting measure, every standardized procedure had rippled through this community in ways he'd never imagined. The true profit of the Golden Pearl wasn't just in its bank account, it was in the web of human connections that kept it running. His employees weren't just line items in a budget. They were people with dreams, struggles, and an incredible capacity for compassion, even in the face of hardship. As the family left, their faces glowing with the joy of an unexpected kindness, Mr. Lee touched the brass ring on his finger. He'd started this experiment wanting to learn about his restaurant's operations. Instead, he was learning about the true meaning of wealth and how it had nothing to do with the numbers in his bank account. Friday night at the Golden Pearl was always the busiest, but this particular evening felt different. From his observation spot, Mr. Lee could sense an unusual tension in the air. The kitchen staff had been running at full speed since the afternoon, and even through the walls, he could hear the clatter of dishes and the shouting of orders reaching a fevered pitch. He watched Mr. Park pace nervously near the back entrance, phone pressed to his ear. Yes, I understand we need to meet the numbers this week, he was saying, but we're already running with minimal staff. After hanging up, he stormed into the kitchen, and soon after, Mr. Lee could hear him arguing with Mrs. Lee about cutting corners to speed up service. These recipes take time, Mrs. Lee's voice carried through the back door. You can't rush proper cooking. Corporate doesn't care about proper cooking, Mr. Park shot back. They care about numbers. Just find a way to make it work. The evening progressed with this underlying tension. Mr. Lee noticed the kitchen staff moving faster than usual, their faces showing signs of stress as they rushed between tasks. Mr. Wu, who usually took time to chat with the dishwasher during smoke breaks, barely had time to catch his breath between prep tasks. Around 8 p.m., the first sign of trouble appeared. A thin trail of smoke, different from the usual cooking vapors, began seeping out from under the kitchen door. At first, nobody seemed to notice, but Mr. Lee's heart started racing. He'd seen enough kitchen fires in his youth to recognize the warning signs. Suddenly, everything happened at once. The smoke alarm's shrill cry pierced the air. Through the windows, Mr. Lee could see diners looking up in confusion. Then came the shouts from the kitchen and the unmistakable orange glow of flames reflected on the back wall. Fire! Everyone out! Mrs. Lee's voice cut through the chaos like a knife. Mr. Lee watched in amazement as she took charge, directing staff and customers with remarkable calm. Front of house, get the dining room cleared. Kitchen staff, fire suppression system now. Mr. Park burst out of the office, but instead of helping with the evacuation, he ran straight to the bar. Through the window, Mr. Lee could see him frantically gathering bottles of expensive liquor, stuffing them into boxes. We can't lose the top-shelf inventory, he shouted when the hostess tried to get him to help with the customers. The scene that unfolded showed everyone's true colors. The young dishwasher was helping elderly customers find their way to the exit. Mr. Wu had grabbed the fire extinguisher and was working alongside Mrs. Lai to contain the blaze. The pregnant prep cook was calmly but firmly guiding people away from the smoke. Mr. Lee stood up, forgetting for a moment that he was supposed to be invisible. His instinct was to rush in and help, but he forced himself to stay put, knowing he couldn't plug his cover. The weight of his powerlessness hit him hard as he watched his restaurant, his people, facing this crisis. Through the chaos, he noticed something remarkable. Mrs. Lai was keeping count, touching each employee on the shoulder as they exited, muttering numbers under her breath. When she reached the back door, her face changed. "Where's Mr. Wu?" she demanded. The young prep cook spoke up. He went back in to check the storage room. Some of the new staff might not know about the back exit. Without hesitation, Mrs. Lee turned to go back in, but the flames had grown. Mr. Park grabbed her arm. "Are you crazy? Let the firefighters handle it." She shook him off. "We don't leave our people behind." Just then, Mr. Wu emerged from the smoke, helping two new servers who had indeed been trapped near the storage area. His face was smudged with soot, but he was smiling. "All clear," he coughed. "Everyone's out." As sirens wailed in the distance, Mr. Lee noticed something else. In all the chaos, he was the only one who saw Mr. Park slip away with his boxes of rescued liquor, leaving his staff to handle the emergency. But he also saw Mrs. Lee doing one final head count, including the homeless man who always sat near their door, him. "You need to move back," she called out to him, genuine concern in her voice. "The smoke's not good for anyone. Even in crisis, she thought about everyone's safety, not just her staff's. The fire department arrived quickly, and the blaze was contained before it could spread beyond the kitchen. As the smoke cleared and the immediate danger passed, Mr. Lee watched his employees gather in the parking lot. They hugged each other, checked on one another, shared water bottles, and offered jackets to those who'd run out without their belongings. Mr. Park returned once the firefighters declared the building secure, making a show of taking charge and calling corporate. But Mr. Lee noticed how the staff naturally gathered around Mrs. Lee instead, looking to her for guidance and reassurance. The morning after the fire, Mr. Lee woke up early in his temporary shelter. Today was the day he would shed his disguise and reveal the truth. He touched the brass ring on his finger one last time before removing it, along with the worn clothes that had been his identity for 2 weeks. In his penthouse apartment, the transformation back to himself felt strange. As he put on his tailored suit, each familiar piece now carried a different weight. The Italian leather shoes felt too smooth, the silk tie too soft. Mrs. Zhang watched him adjust his cuffs, her usual professional demeanor softened by understanding. "Are you ready?" she asked, handing him his watch, a simple yet expensive piece he hadn't worn in 2 weeks. "No," he answered honestly, "but it's time." The staff meeting was scheduled for 9 a.m. at the Golden Pearl. The restaurant was still smoky, but the cleanup crew had worked through the night to make the dining room usable. As Mr. Lee approached the front door, he could see his employees gathered inside, their faces tired but determined. Mr. Park was at the front, trying to take charge. "Corporate will be sending someone today to assess the damage and review our procedures. We need to present a united front and stick to the official story about the fire." Mrs. Lai stood at the back of the room, arms crossed, with Mr. Wu and the kitchen staff clustered around her. The young dishwasher was helping the pregnant prep cook clean soot from the windows. Everyone looked up when the bell above the door chimed. Mr. Lee walked in, and for a moment, nobody moved. Then Mr. Park rushed forward, hand extended. "Mr. Lee, we weren't expecting you back from Asia until next week. I can explain everything about the fire." "Actually," Mr. Lee interrupted quietly, "I've been here the whole time." He looked around the room, meeting each person's eyes. Some showed confusion, others disbelief. "For the past 2 weeks, I've been sitting outside your back door." The silence that followed was deafening. Mrs. Lai was the first to understand, her eyes widening in recognition. The young dishwasher dropped his cleaning rag. Mr. Wu took an unconscious step backward. "The homeless man," the pregnant prep cook whispered. "The one who?" Mr. Lee nodded. "Yes. I wanted to understand this restaurant, not from reports or numbers, but from the ground up. I needed to see who we really are when nobody's watching." Mr. Park's face had gone pale. "Sir, I can explain the inventory decisions and the staffing cuts. Can you explain throwing away good food while people go hungry?" Mr. Lee's voice was quiet but firm. "Can you explain hiding during a fire to save bottles of liquor while your staff risked their lives to save each other?" The room erupted in whispers. Mr. Park started to speak again, but Mr. Lee held up his hand. "But that's not why I'm here today." He turned to face the entire staff. "I'm here because in these 2 weeks, I've seen extraordinary things. I've seen kindness in small gestures and courage in big moments. I've seen leadership that had nothing to do with titles and everything to do with heart." He walked over to Mrs. Lai. "I've seen a head cook who feeds her staff from her own kitchen because our meal allowance isn't enough." Then to Mr. Wu, "A young man pursuing his education while working 2 jobs because our entry-level wages don't cover basic needs." Moving through the room, he acknowledged each person he observed. A dishwasher who shares his bread with strangers. A prep cook who stands up for food safety despite pressure to cut corners. Staff members who support each other through hardships I never knew about because I never bothered to look. Tears were flowing freely now, not just from the staff, but from Mr. Lee himself. Yesterday's fire showed me everything. It showed me who runs toward danger to help others and who runs away to save things. It showed me how my own policies and pressure for profits created conditions that put you all at risk. He reached into his jacket and pulled out a stack of papers. "So today, we start over. First, Mr. Park, your resignation is accepted, effective immediately." Mr. Park opened his mouth to protest, But Mr. Lee continued, "Mrs. Lai, I'd like to promote you to General Manager with full authority over kitchen and staff operations. Your first task will be to help me implement these changes." He held up the papers, new wage structures that ensure no one needs a second job to survive, full healthcare coverage for all employees, including part-time staff, an education assistance program to help those pursuing degrees or professional certifications. The room was absolutely silent as he continued. "We're also creating a community outreach program, including a daily meal service for those in need, using our extra food that we won't be throwing away anymore, and a profit-sharing system so everyone benefits from our success." Mr. Wu raised his hand hesitantly. "Sir, all this will cut into profits significantly." Mr. Lee smiled. "You're right. And when you finish your MBA, I hope you'll help me prove that treating people right is the best long-term business strategy we can have." He looked around the room again, seeing hope begin to replace shock on people's faces. "I learned more sitting on that sidewalk than I have in all my years of reading reports and spreadsheets. I learned that the Golden Pearl isn't just a restaurant, it's a community. And from now on, we're going to act like one." Mrs. Lai stepped forward. "The cleanup crew is coming at 10. We should get started if we want to reopen soon." "Actually," Mr. Lee said, "we're going to take our time with the reopening. Do it right. And everyone will receive full pay during the renovation." He rolled up his sleeves. "Now, who's going to show me how to properly clean a smoke-damaged kitchen?" The tension in the room broke as people laughed. Soon, they were organizing into teams, with Mrs. Lai directing operations just as efficiently as she had during the fire. Mr. Lee watched his employees, no, his family, coming together, and knew that the hardest part of his journey was just beginning. As he picked up a cleaning brush, the young dishwasher appeared at his side. "Sir, that bread you shared with me last week, did you actually need it?" Mr. Lee paused, remembering the moment. "No," he said honestly, "but the kindness behind it. I needed that more than you know." 6 months after the fire, the Golden Pearl had become something nobody could have imagined. The renovation took longer than expected, but every delay had a purpose. Mr. Lee insisted on doing things right, from installing top-of-the-line safety equipment to creating a more comfortable work environment for his staff. The morning of the grand reopening dawned bright and clear. Mr. Lee stood outside, remembering his days sitting on the sidewalk. The spot where he used to observe now had a small garden with benches, tended by the staff during their breaks. Above it, a simple sign read, "Everyone deserves dignity. Rest here if you need to." Inside, the changes were even more remarkable. The kitchen had been expanded, with proper ventilation and state-of-the-art equipment. But more importantly, the culture had transformed. Mrs. Lai ran the restaurant with the same care and attention she'd always shown, but now she had the authority and resources to make real changes. "The breakfast crowd will be here soon," she said, appearing beside Mr. Lee. "Are you ready?" He smiled, watching his employees prepare for the day. The young dishwasher, now enrolled in culinary school thanks to the education program, was carefully arranging fresh flowers on each table. Mr. Wu, having completed his MBA, split his time between managing the restaurant's finances and mentoring other employees interested in business education. The pregnant prep cook had returned from maternity leave to find a new mother's room installed near the break area. She now headed the community outreach program, turning her experience of nearly being turned away into a mission to help others. "Look who's here," Mrs. Lee nodded toward the door. The elderly couple who used to leave extra-large tips were first in line, beaming at the sight of the renovated space. Behind them, a growing crowd of regular customers waited eagerly. But mixed among them were some new faces, people who might have been turned away in the past. A group of homeless individuals stood nervously at the edge of the crowd. The young dishwasher immediately walked over to greet them. "Welcome to the Golden Pearl," he said warmly. "Your breakfast is already being prepared." This was part of the new program, Dignity First community meals served at proper tables, not as handouts, but as a regular part of the restaurant's service. The morning unfolded like a well-rehearsed dance. Every table was full, with conversations and laughter filling the air. In one corner, a local business owner discussed expanding the job training program they'd started. At another table, a former homeless man celebrated his first week of employment at the restaurant. The kitchen hummed with positive energy. Gone were the shouts and stress of the past. Instead, there was purposeful movement and collaboration. The new profit-sharing system meant everyone had a stake in the restaurant's success, but they measured that success differently now. "Our food costs are actually down," Mr. Wu reported during the mid-morning break. "Turns out when you trust people and give them the resources they need, they find ways to reduce waste naturally. And our customer satisfaction scores are the highest they've ever been." Mr. Lee watched as a young woman arrived for her interview. Unlike the tense, rushed interviews of the past, she was greeted warmly and invited to share a cup of coffee while discussing opportunities. The Golden Pearl had become known as the best place to work in the area, with a waiting list of applicants. During lunch, Mr. Lee sat at the counter, something he did regularly now. He watched as a businessman tried to pay for a homeless man's meal, only to learn it had already been covered by the community meal program. "But I want to help," the businessman insisted. Mrs. Lee smiled. "Then join our business skills mentorship program. Sometimes people need more than a meal, they need a chance." The afternoon brought a visit from corporate headquarters. The executives had been skeptical of Mr. Lee's changes at first, but the numbers were impossible to ignore. Not only was the Golden Pearl profitable, but it had become a model for other restaurants in the chain. "Your staff turnover is practically zero," one executive marveled. "And these community programs, they're actually driving business growth. People want to be part of something meaningful," Mr. Lee explained. "When you create a space where both employees and customers feel valued, they become your best advocates." As evening approached, Mr. Lee noticed the young dishwasher teaching a new employee the proper way to fold napkins. "Remember," he overheard, "everything we do here matters. Even the smallest tasks show respect for our guests." The day ended with a staff meal, a tradition that had evolved from Mrs. Lee's secret food sharing. Now, employees sat together each evening, sharing food and stories. Sometimes, community members joined them. Tonight, a former regular from Mr. Lee's homeless days was there, celebrating his new apartment. "I never thought a restaurant could change lives," Mrs. Lee said, sitting next to Mr. Lee. "But look at us now." Mr. Lee looked around the room, at the proud faces of his employees, at the mixed group of customers lingering over coffee, at the warm light spilling onto the street where he once sat as an observer. The brass ring he'd worn during his disguise now hung in a frame near the entrance, below a simple message: "Everyone has a story." "We're not just changing lives," he replied. "We're showing what's possible when we see people as people, not just numbers on a spreadsheet." As the last customers left for the night, Mr. Lee stepped outside once more. The garden lights illuminated the benches where people could rest, and tomorrow's breakfast prep was already underway in the kitchen. The Golden Pearl glowed like a beacon in the evening darkness, not just of light and warmth, but of hope and dignity. A passerby stopped to read the new mission statement etched on the window: "Good food served with dignity, by people treated with respect, in a place where everyone belongs." Mr. Lee smiled, knowing that his 2 weeks as a homeless observer had led to something far more valuable than any business success. It had created a template for compassionate capitalism, a proof that doing good and doing well could go hand in hand. As he turned to leave, he saw a familiar face, the street musician who had once shared her coffee with him during his experiment. She was now playing her violin in the garden, hired by the restaurant to provide evening entertainment. Her music floated on the night air, a reminder that sometimes the smallest acts of kindness can set in motion changes that nobody could have imagined.